Welcome everyone to track 6. We are joined for our last session of the day, our 4 o'clock, with Charles Burton. Charles Burton is coming to us today from Lake Charles, Louisiana, and he has led technology teams in Louisiana government for 20 years, and I don't know how to pronounce this, but I will try. The Calcasieu Parish? Calcasieu, okay, there we go. Calcasieu Parish Technology Director. Data center and communication modernization projects and cybersecurity programs, disaster recovery, and we are going to hear from him today about benefits of holistic identity. So, thank you.
All right, thank you for that introduction. Really appreciate it. Right at the end of the day, so appreciate y'all coming. I think I've got some good content here. The purpose of my session that I submitted, first time here, by the way, so really enjoying the conference. Purpose of my session is to talk about identity, and each organization is going to be a little different, so I'll cover about what it is and things of that nature. I'm not going to talk about any specific products, so I'm going to try to do that whole product-free zone, right? So I'm not selling you anything. But me personally, identity management's been kind of a passion for me. I've been in technology about 30 years, so I spent about half of that time focusing on identity in whatever organization I worked with. So I've got a little bit of experience that I've been able to use with the organizations I've worked with. And, you know, the holistic part is I hope that I can maybe share a few concepts, maybe looking at it from a different perspective kind of a thing. You know, we all have to use usernames and passwords in this world we live in, whether it's with a device or a piece of software, but I think there's more to an identity, okay? So I'll try to cover some of those aspects. So before I go through this, I know I had a description, kind of covered critical infrastructure. I know we've got a small group. Most everyone probably working in an enterprise organization. Is anyone in government, federal, state? No, one, okay. Okay, so I've got a couple of slides on that. I'm gonna cover a few aspects on that as well. Okay, so here's some of the items that we're gonna cover. What is identity, why it's important, crisis management. You know, what is an identity? Again, like I said, I just think of it as username and password, but what is it really there for? Why does it exist? Why it's important? And then some conversations. So I hope to impart to you a few ideas that you may bring back to your organization around the identities you use every day. Because, kind of a spoiler alert, I don't look at identity, even though I spend a lot of my time on cybersecurity, I look at identity, the identities for our employees, those that we work with and those customers we have, as an enabler. It's intended to provide access to functions and achieve things. It's not meant to be a hindrance, you know, and causes problems. So hopefully, you know, maybe I can share a few things during this session about the positive things around identity. Okay, so this is me, that typical slide, who I am, where I come from. I've got a I've got a QR code at the end as well, and I've got my LinkedIn up there. And like I said, a lot of what I'm doing now is focusing on cybersecurity, and you've probably heard that term that, you know, your firewall is not the attack surface anymore. Now it's the humans, it's our employees, and more specifically, it's their identities. And that's what the bad guys want, because they want the information that's behind that identity. So it is an attack surface, and that's where I'm spending most of my time nowadays. Okay, so what is an identity? There's a lot of acronyms. If you're in the federal space, the ICAM, Identity Credential Access Management, will be familiar, especially FICAM. But identity itself is essentially a way to represent ourselves, us as humans, to the technology that we're trying to use. Okay, so again, it's the way to represent us to that technology, whatever it is. so that we can make sure that that system, whatever it is, software, hardware, really knows who it's working with and it's trusted. There's a trusted relationship to use that system. That's really what an identity is. And I remember having this conversation with my boss. I started using the term identity, I don't know how many years ago. He pulled me aside after a meeting and said, Charles, what is this thing identity you keep talking about? Because I had shifted my terminology from, hey, your logins, or hey, your password, or your username. I had shifted to the word identity because I knew behind the scenes in our department, we were putting a whole lot more attributes to their identity, like where are they coming from, who's their boss, what department they lived in, when were they actually trying to use this identity. So we were adding a lot of work to it and a lot of information, a lot of focus on it. So I shifted over to that. So he asked me, he's like, what is this thing identity? I said, well, you know that username and password you log into your computer with? Yeah. It's that and more. It's more about you and what you're trying to do. So you may have those conversations yourself if you start using those terms. But as I put up here, it could be qualities, it could beliefs. You know, there's different ways, again, to look at an identity. It could be a number of things. I've gone to some sessions where they say, well, you know, the bad guys, they know your keystrokes. You know, they know what you like to eat. They know, you know, what you look like. So it could be a lot of things. People could be using information to identify you. So it's a lot of different aspects. And I'll definitely cover more in the slides. Okay, a lot of costs. So if you look out there and any of the information and or of any of the recent breaches that you've heard of, here in the energy industry, like Colonial Pipeline, something like that, what was the attack surface? What was the attack surface for MGM and Caesars recently? Would you say it's the humans? It's their identity? Right. They didn't break down their firewall. They didn't break a device. They wanted their identity so that they could then use it. So 84% of organizations reportedly had identity-related security breaches. It's a lot, and we're probably all experiencing them. I know I am, and I've got a relatively small organization. But, and I think we do a pretty good job trying to shore up and protect those identities, but that is still the largest attack surface we have, okay, is their identities. That's what the bad guys want. And then why is that? Well, it's because they're growing. You'll probably all rather not have more logins to remember, right? I'd rather not have another username, rather not have another system say, create a password to get into this system. You'd rather not have it. But unfortunately, the growth is just exponential. Every day there's another one, right? There's more and there's more. Now, I'll cover in some slides some of those tools and mechanisms that are out there to help us with those, right? Some of those systems out on the internet, you can use other identity systems, in place of other products. But so we've got this trouble is that identity is the largest attack surface, and then the number of them are just growing exponentially. So if you look at it from that perspective, it could be pretty dangerous, okay? And then down here, more for your enterprise folks, that IAM problem, IAM, identity and access management, it could be a shadow IT problem. I stopped at a couple of the vendors out here who have some great products, and they were demonstrating, do you know where your employees are using their identities? And they had good pictures. Yeah, they're using it all over the internet, right? So shadow IT doesn't help. It could be a problem. Exceptions then solutions. That's something I've definitely experienced. So if you have let's say they believe you have a good, strong identity plan for your organization. Let's say you've got a good, strong identity system, identity provider, identity management solution. Great. But what you got to look out for, where are those exceptions? They're like, man, we have this great identity provider. Well, but these 2 or 3 products that our employees need every day, it doesn't work with those. So those are the exceptions. So those, as I've talked to more folks that are maybe running some very good identity programs, they still have those exceptions as well. So it's keeping an eye on those exceptions. And then any primary system out of an identity management system, hopefully there's not much of that. I know I had that for a while. Our primary ERP system that ran our organization could not integrate with our modernized identity system for a couple of years, and those were some sleepless nights, I will tell you, because all the user management and all the security and all the keep an eye on all the logins that was held within that SaaS product, that concerns me, that we couldn't bring all that information together and really keep an eye on who's accessing our information. But luckily, we were able to move past that. So that there can be problems, they do exist, but and they can take time to solve. Okay, again, another couple of sessions talk about privacy, and when I have this conversation with folks, especially those that are early in the journey, talking about their identities of their employees and how they're going to use them, privacy comes up. Now, privacy and security are separate things, okay? They're not the same. So you can achieve security without privacy, but you can't achieve privacy without security. Okay, so what does that mean? So we can achieve achieve security, okay, but let's say we have a breach, okay. So let's say I have a breach. I have a collection of information that unfortunately the bad guys were able to get some of the information, and it gets out, okay. That's a security problem because there was a breach, okay. That's a security. It may not necessarily be a privacy problem. Because again, I work in local government. That information they stole may not be private. It may not carry PII, right? Or confidential information that's important to my organization. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the privacy comes in usually when it involves, like I was just stating, either PII when it has to do with an individual, right? You know, someone's personal information, or confidential information on your organization. They are separate concepts. A lot of people put them together, but just be on the lookout for that, okay? Okay, there's a lot of steps to modernizing identity. So I've got a few up here. And again, the purpose of this session is really to give you some things to think about back in your organization, hopefully a few tips you can take back with you. Strengthening, simplifying identities for non-humans, you know, those are those service accounts. Connecting to on-premise vendors, eliminating those separate systems. COOP and BCP, that's an interesting perspective, I think, personally, is because as we went about building an identity program in our organization, and you know, we've got a couple of dozen integrations now, we went to a number of our departments or affiliated agencies. They said, okay, look, we're going to improve your identity service. We're going to make it easier for your employees. And, you know, we're going to take care of this for you. You won't have to create accounts. You won't have to manage the identity anymore. The very next question was, well, what if you're unavailable? I can't get access to my system. So invariably, there's going to be a continuity of operations question that comes up. So be ready for those. And that leads into the stakeholder support, stakeholder awareness, kind of how those systems work. I remember having a conversation with our finance department. We were integrating the identity system for a key web service that they used, and we hadn't done it yet. And I said, well, it was a conversation of how they used it today. And she said, well, I think our employees, let's see. She said, I think they all keep their own passwords. They create them themselves, and they keep them like at their desk. It's like, okay, all right. Well, what if they forget them? What happens? Oh, well, there's a button on the website. We just, hit the reset, and they reset it all the time. I say, okay. So, and then there's somebody we can call. I said, okay, well, what we'll do is they won't have to remember a password anymore. We'll make it single sign-on. It'll be seamless now. And we'll get all the telemetry, and we'll make it more secure. That's great. And she's like, well, what if that service fails, I said, well, you still can go to the company, the provider, and click that link and reset and still access that product. There are still ways to do it. There's always a backup plan, and we have those documented. So a lot of times it's just a conversation so they know what those plans are. So. And then for our federal folks, I've had a number of conversations about folks. So on the right-hand side, those are PIV and CAC type credentials you might see for folks in our federal. So I've had a similar session in some conferences that are mostly filled with federal folks, and we have good conversations about where this program has been around for many, many years, and what are the wheels that are turning behind it, and it works very, very well. It's essentially a passwordless, tokenized solution. It does have some weaknesses. A federal employee must be issued one of these IDs, and they must use it to access whatever information system they have. But there are some weaknesses in that it must be a live system. So I can use my PIV or CAC card, but if there's some type of communication breakdown, it won't work. So it has to be and that is dependent upon the agency or the system you're asking most of the time. But the next question was, like for us in Calcasieu Parish, when we have maybe a federally declared disaster, we're starting to have to use federal systems to begin the recovery process. Well, we don't have these cards, so we don't have access to those systems. We haven't been pre-vetted. So there's a lot of work that goes on to maintaining these systems. The good news is there's a lot of conversation around passkeys, FIDO standards that the feds are looking at to really evolve this system into a more modern, so that it wouldn't require something physical. There'll be something a little more ephemeral, but it will be secure. So this is a good representation of someone's identity, in the federal government, but there are some weaknesses to it. Okay, and interoperability, which I was just kind of talking about. Again, I can kind of move over this, but there's this conversation about identity amongst government agencies, but there's no teeth behind what direction we're going and when we're going to get there. The good news is that NIST has been able to come out with a few proposals on where we're going, and then CISA is supporting them in that effort. And there could be some funding coming eventually, but there is some more work to do here. The intergovernmental part is key, because our federal government all has these different agencies, and they don't all have to agree, but they need to work together. That's for sure. Okay, and I think this is my last on the federal government items, but I like this slide in that it has some of those enterprise technologies listed in it. SAML, and we've got, I think, FIDO in there as well. Yes, so these are standards. SAML you might be familiar with. It's used in your enterprise organization. It's a more modern protocoling use. FIDO, which the trend with FIDO has been, came on really strong, then it kind of tapered off a little bit because it's a little harder to implement. Well, now it's kind of coming back with FIDO 2 because they're talking about pass keys and the ability to, store keys on devices and even synchronize keys across devices. So it's becoming a little more consumer friendly. So, but they're still very, very strong. So they're building in some of these attributes for identity and these standards. Okay, and a little bit on the popular technologies. I know, like I said, I do have another slide on some of these technologies because I know some of them are familiar to you if you're familiar with identity. SAML and LDAP, on-premise. Again, popular technologies. And it's interesting, each of the, when you you start this identity journey, you start having conversations with your staff or maybe software providers or hardware vendors where you need to integrate identity. It's really an open-ended beginning conversation. It's like, what do you support? Well, we'd like to make it easier for our employees. We'd like to be more productive. We'd like to be more secure. And then typically you start working down, well, what actually do you support? And you just start running down this list. You typically try not to start with the less secure. You want to start with the more secure options. But unfortunately, you've got to work down that list. You know, the one in the middle was interesting. We've actually had providers say, look, we didn't really build to standards, but we have an API. And I'm like, what does that mean? They're like, well, yeah, we didn't really build any open standards, but if you want to manage the identities and you want to pass authentication, we have an SDK where you would build an API interface. That was an interesting conversation, and we actually used it and built it. And it was a lot of work. Luckily, that was years ago, and most people built on standards nowadays, but it does come up sometimes. Social media. I'm sure you've all been to different websites in the world where it says, hey, instead of creating an account here, why don't you just use your Facebook login, or why don't you just use your Google login? There's plenty of these options out there. The trick for the enterprise is, you know your employees are having to go out on the internet and research and gather information, so you know they're going to be presented with these options. So the tricky part is, you know, do you expose your own identity system to be used in place of that? Or say, yeah, you can go ahead and do that, or you could try and block it with some type of endpoint protection system that, you know, will try to, you know, prevent them from maybe using a personal Google account with a box to start storing work files in. It's a tricky conversation. I get to have it pretty regularly with our employees. We have pretty decent tools to keep an eye on it. Myself personally, I tend to stay away from it. Not that I think there's any, you know, I mean, there is some risk, but and it is a convenience. I will definitely say, but those social media logins can be tricky from an identity perspective, because everyone that you allow to use that is basically sending all your identity information along with it: when, where, how, who. So it just makes it easier for them to track you. So it's an available and it is convenience, but it definitely brings its risks. And the last one, state-issued IDs. There isn't a standard for it, but a number of states are doing digital IDs, and they're doing it in different ways. Every state, you know, some states are doing it via some collective standards they come up with. Some are not. I will say the state that I live in has had a digital ID via a specific app they make available to the citizens. And the digital ID that I have, I'm able to use it in other states. They use it and they'll accept it. But, however, it doesn't integrate easily with standards. So, for instance, I can't add my state ID to, say, an Apple Wallet, for example, because that's an integration that's not available. I think where this is going, though, is going to be good for the enterprise, because we're going to be able to eventually, if some of you may or not be doing it now, when we have employees that we need to, you know, vet that are coming to us for employment, you know, if we had a verifiable digital method to be able to bring those into the system, I think that's going to make it a lot easier, and it's going to speed up verification. So I'm looking forward to being able to do that. Okay, some keep in minds, just from my experience. That top one there, again, I've mentioned it a couple of times. I try not to talk to folks initially about the security around identity management. I try to talk to them about, hey, it's an enabler of work. We're trying to remove the roadblocks, make it easier. We like your employee to just walk into their office, sit in front of their computer, and the computer recognizes them, and they go to work, and then they have access to all the tools they need. They step away and then they no longer have access. It sounds nice. Maybe it's a little difficult to do in some instances, but that's really the goal, is to make it an enabler of work. Stakeholder alignment, again, like I was saying, talking to those that are my peers in the organization so that they understand how important an identity is. I remember at one point, I'm sure if any of you have been on this journey, well, we don't have to create logins for these people. They do this, or they work in the field, or they're in some role where they may not be assigned a computer. Those days are, I would say, long past. There's probably plenty of reasons why you would like to have your employees have an identity, maybe for training reasons, just information gathering so that they can log in and get access to information. There are plenty of reasons for it. Identifying who governs an identity. Now, this might sound a little odd. In our organization, I campaigned on this quite some time. An identity, this is my position, an identity is a strategic asset to the organization. An identity is not an IT function. Okay? So, because if an identity doesn't work for an employee, what are they doing? They probably can't do much. They're going to be impacted. They can't do the business of the organization. So my reasoning, the way I presented it to my, all of my leaders, is that an identity is part of the organization. And look, hey, by the way, IT, we're getting out of this business. This is now an organizational process. So we did. We shifted it because we, quite frankly, don't declare who is an employee and who's not an employee, right? That's someone else does that. So we built in automation that says when you're an employee, you get an identity, and when you're not, you don't have one. And then what about all the other squishy stuff, like they have skills, they need to have access to tools, they need to have, what if they change departments, they change their name? Automate all that stuff. We still get calls today and says, well, I changed departments, and we're like, great, happy for you. What do you need from us? Well, I changed department. Well, that's all automated. We don't do that. That's someone else decides what departments you work in, not IT. So it's a really good conversation. My peers have really gotten behind it because they can see the value of it, because IT's we're not the holdup, because it's now shifted. There are different parts of our organization responsible for that aspect. Make sure that it's secure and there's processes, but we don't create them, we don't decommission them, we don't manage them. Those are all, and I don't mean shift it all to HR. I know some of you are probably like, well, just give it to HR. Well, the HR director and I had some good conversations on that, and she wanted to make sure that that's not what I was telling people. I said, no, this is an organizational thing. We all have a role in it. So that's my perspective, it's really who governs the identity. I said, we all do, because it's important that our employee has one. Like I was mentioning, align with the business to make sure that their identity aligns with their business goals. Aligning with the business goals, just a quick kind of a departure on that, is that, like I said, the employee has certain roles, and through their life of working through your organization, they may shift departments, they may shift roles, their skills may grow. So they may need more things. Maybe they need more assets, maybe they need access to more software, maybe they need more licensing. The value in an identity will say if that shifts with them automatically, instead of having to request it. So we've tied a lot of that function into their actual work profile. So as they change roles, as they change level, they might be licensed up, or licensed down, depending on where they go, or their access to their tooling. It really adds value and benefit to that identity. Regular reporting. Yeah, it's definitely going to take some regular reporting. So we built our own, kind of rolled our own. So because instead of buying a product to do all this stuff I'm talking about, we built our own. So we need to make sure it worked right. So we have automated reporting that goes to whoever the employee supervisor is, whoever is in their department, and then goes to the key IT people that might need to keep an eye on the security aspect. And it's regular. Some of it is daily. Not all of it's daily, but some of it is. And our people keep an eye on it. I think that's a key part, especially when you're starting out. And then the last bit, I'm working with an organization actually in my area right now, starting with just managing what they have. You know, when I gave them some of these perspectives, like everyone should have an identity, you shouldn't even be responsible, it should be automated, you should do this, it's secure, it should be passwordless. I'll give them all this, they just get blown away. I said, whoa, let's just start managing what you have. Start there, and then you can kind of grow. And it's working out pretty well for them. It's a smaller organization, but they're putting in some of those processes and having those conversations about, look, everyone should have an identity. Everyone should have their roles tied to their identity so that it flows with their work. Okay? Okay. Again, just a little bit, I mentioned it a couple of times, a little bit of the attributes that you can add to an identity that you could think about. I know some of this might look a little strange for some folks, but we try to layer in a lot of information with our identities, as much as we possibly can. And some of it, like I said, some of it might look a little like what department you work for, sure, okay. What's your job title, okay. Who's your boss, that's fine. Put that all in your identity. But then it gets into like, well, what are your skills? What's your photo? What's your geolocation? Some might say, well, it's a little risky. True, but I can give you some really good examples where it's definitely added value into their identities. For instance, I'll start with the geolocation because some people get pretty stressed about that part. So when an employee in our organization, they have an office they report to. Okay, so they might report to this city or this building. Okay, so there's a static location. So we don't have trackers on them, but they have a static location. So this is where they're reporting. Then other employees, maybe it's a little more in depth where they need to know what are their whereabouts. Okay, that might be like our Homeland Security office or some office where they have to respond to something. Okay, we have folks in the field that are constantly out in the community. That information has been valuable in a number of ways. Let's say, I could use the example of hurricanes, but like a ice storm or a snowstorm, okay? Well, we know down here in the South, it gets a little icy or a little snow, bridges and roads, we don't know how to drive, okay? It gets kind of dangerous. So if that happens overnight, I know all our leaders, they are confident that they can reach to our emergency notification system, okay, and contact the employees in a certain area, say, look, I need you to not come home because this bridge is dangerous, or I need you to not come to work because this bridge is dangerous, or I need you to report to an alternate office, okay? Now, the old traditional way is like, you do the call town tree. But what we've done is with our identity system, it's real time. So we know all that information is current, accurate, and every employee it's going to reach and when and where they are because it flows into that system out of our identity system. So there's no like keeping track of all these records and having to fill in those pieces of paper. As long as the system works, we can reach them and we know where they are. So that's just an example. Like the phone number, it just says phone, but shoot, we bring in like 4, sometimes 5 different phone numbers for an employee into our system. Now, just because it's a part of their identity, we may not let it flow into all the systems, but you could have a business issued mobile, you could have a personal mobile, you could have a home phone, you might even have a relative phone or emergency contact, things like that. Depending upon the system, we can tune the identity system and say, okay, this is for internal communication. The other employees don't need to know this employee's personal cell phone, okay? So we won't feed it into that system, but it is available in the identity system. So we can put gates on it. Now, for our emergency notification system, yeah, it gets all the phone numbers because we might have to reach them when and wherever they are. So those are just examples. feeding your identity with all the more attributes is just going to improve the usability of it, okay? And also could be the security of it. So, you know, if you spend any time in cybersecurity, you know location-based authentication is absolutely very important. So if you feed it into a modern identity system, it can be consumed by those other applications you might be integrating with, okay? So for example, you know, you might, well, I can give a good example. So we have recreation systems that are all over the place, and different parks, pools, things like that. So we know where the employees should report, things like that. And, you know, some of our timekeeping systems, some of them, you know, log the location of where the employee actually clocked in and out. Some of you may have those systems. Well, we can put metrics that say, okay, are they within, you know, 20 miles of where they're supposed to log in, yes or no? And then, you know, have a log on that, or have a report or an alert. So pretty basic, okay? Now some would say, well, I need to maintain that information in that system. All I'm saying is that that can be achieved by your one identity system, is what I'm saying. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. It's a bit of an eye chart. It's not, it's not to read it all, but implementing an identity system and maintaining that identity system, it is an exercise, and it doesn't really have an end. So you're going to start, and you're going to keep the process going. So you start with the fundamentals, you start with the inventory, you do that status and reporting, the things I was mentioning. It's a cycle, okay? It's not a one-shot. I know there's a number of very good identity providers out there that say, hey, it's a one-shot, you buy this and it's done. I'd say, you probably could. There are some very good ones out there. For us, it works better that it's a constant exercise. It's just a regular cycle that we keep an eye on. So, because there's a lot of complexity. I mean, it also includes training your employees and keeping them aware of the system, and as employees come into the system, really understanding how it works. I know I still have conversations with my peers about the impacts on the organization. I had a meeting this week about our public works employees who are constantly out in the field, and they have identities and they need to use them, and they were having trouble. So still, that conversation is relevant. Okay, what are your customers? So my customers are the employees in our organization and the citizens that I serve. What do they want? Well, first of all, they said, look, most of the time I'm just trying to get my job done, or I'm in this office to get something done. I don't need to know about an identity. So, okay, great. But really, well, I have all these passwords. Well, okay, well, let's work on getting rid of those passwords with a strong identity. Well, then I have compliance requirements. We can help you with those as long as we have a modern identity. We can check those boxes. Centralized management might take a little time because it's a lot more conversation. So these are really, it's looking at it from the perspective of a customer. Look, I've spent 30 years in technology, and believe me, I spent a lot of time just focusing on the technology, trying to achieve the business's goals, which is great, leverage the technology as a tool to achieve those goals. But sometimes I just had to stop and say, really, what do you want? Like, what, for the customer, what does the customer want? And they really just want to get their job done. They don't have to worry about all this identity stuff. So there's a lot of tooling out there and a lot of things that you can do to help with that. Like I said, passwordless is fantastic. We're using it across our organization. As long as it's leveraged with, all those identity metrics that you keep an eye on, those all the aspects around they're meeting all the security controls. Trying to think of the word. Not compliance. I'll think of it in a minute. But centralized management would improve productivity and the experience. So, customer's perspective. And as I mentioned a couple of times, yeah, there's a lot of application opportunities out there. Try to be a part of that procurement process. I had a good conversation with my boss this week about some products that were purchased in one of our departments, and it came with virtually no identity clauses, so we have no idea what we're getting into. And so try to be a part of those. I know that's difficult nowadays. Believe me, everyone with a credit card believes they can buy the right product for your organization. I know, I've been there. But try to be a part of those early conversations. You know, scope the expectations without hard requirements. I learned that too because I started to try to build in identity requirements into every boilerplate contract. And our finance department thought it was a great idea. Let's just build all this in, requirement. Well, quickly realizing that a lot of the application vendors, they don't call this that, or they just don't do this. So there had to be a little more wiggle room. So, you know, scope it, possibly without hard requirements. I guess it depends on your organization. Seeking those opportunities in uncommon places. So, yeah, because sometimes it's a conversation with these vendors. Again, we're on application vendors. We operate a lot of, not a lot, but we operate a number of facilities that the community can rent. Okay, so they might rent a park space, they might rent a convention space, or RV slip, or different things like that. And some of those application vendors, they were unique in how they approached identity. So going back to, some of them allowed the visitors to use social media accounts to create their identities, which is convenient. Well, we said, well, we'd like to have something a little more trackable, a little more, you know, informative. So, and then their next statement was, well, not only the customers, but also your employees that are going to be using the system, they're going to need to use their Facebook logins to access our product. I said, whoa, time out. Let's have a deeper conversation about identity. But at the end of the conversation, the vendor had a really good understanding of where we were coming from. And not only did they started out with, well, it's going to be it's going to cost this much and take this much time, and at the end of the conversation, they said, no, this is not going to be any cost for this. We really understand where you're going. It's a give and take sometimes. So I'm sure many of you experienced that. And that leads into that next one, beware of the paywall. Yeah, I really don't believe that it's now I'm not a software producer, but or a software developer, but you know, to charge me to use my own identities with your product is a tough sell for me. So I'm saying, you know, when I go to buy a product, I love telling them, like, look, I want to buy your product, it's fantastic. Look, give me all the identity. I will take care of all of it. Just give me the ability to do it, okay? And whatever way you want to, just give it to me. And they say, well, that's going to be $10,000. I'm like, okay, we're going to have another conversation, because they put it right behind a paywall, even though I'm taking over the responsibility of identities. So most vendors are open to it. And vaulting. Yeah, that's kind of it's not a last resort, but I will say, as good as we are with identities, we do vaulting. And what I mean by that is that there's always a few of those products that you can't put in an identity management system, so we provide vaulting to our employees. Basically a password keeper that's an enterprise solution, okay? So if we can't seamlessly SSO them, they can use our vaulting solution to vault their credentials in whatever system they need. I really think that's important for an organization to have. And it's self-service. Like, they don't have to call us, they don't have to license it. It's a couple of clicks, it's theirs, and they're off and running, vaulting their own credentials. Okay, and I'm going to skip this slide. And critical infrastructure, there are some certifications if you're interested. There's an IDS Alliance, Identity Service Alliance, and I've got NIST up there. Like I said, NIST is adding some teeth to identity standards. It's the CHIPS. I think it's the CHIPS and Science Act. Actually, the feds put some money behind it for some more standardization. And your call to action. This is pretty much my last slide, because we're about out of time. review your existing identity attributes. See if you can bring in some more attributes that'll add value, okay? Integration, automation, talk to your HR department. It's not going to be their responsibility completely, but just let them know that, look, we're trying, when you hire an employee, we want them to go to work immediately, and we don't want to have to, we want to ease the process. And determine whether you can begin in-house or seek assistance from an identity provider. I'm a very small shop. I'm a tiny shop, but I've got just a couple of good staff that were really, really interested in doing identity work, and we've come a long way by ourselves. So really proud of that. All right, and that's all of my session. Thank you all, and if you have any questions, I'll take any questions since we're out of time. Yes, sir. Yeah, that has, yeah. It's an excellent question. The short answer is I haven't solved it. But, so what, we've got the same thing is I have elected officials. Actually, I have a council, and then I have an elected seat there. And we have an excellent document management system. So the processes of going and signing and approving and things like that. And if they're no longer an employee, they're out of that elected role. They no longer have those privileges. So we were looking at tokenizing something that would essentially be a token that would be, this was an idea that was actually, one of my staff came up with this idea. And we were going to tokenize every employee, okay, so that they would have a token and it would have basically an unlimited life. But we'd be able to verify, we'd have a CRL so we could, revoke it if we needed to, but we would tokenize their identity, and we would use that for that process. And even if they left the organization, we would maintain that token indefinitely. That was a concept. We haven't, moved on that, but I don't have a good answer for that one. But you're right, because as people move through the organization, it's easy for, just an employee that's just, maybe going to a managerial role and then maybe not going in a managerial role. We can make those moves, but where they have authority, governing authority or statutory authority or legislative authority, it does get a little more challenging. So, yeah. But thank you for that question. Anything else? All right, well, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. And it's the end of the day, so I think we've got to